Left adrift in the vast, icy ocean, a mother pitbull fights to keep her two tiny puppies alive inside a rusted barrel. Alone, helpless, and with the waves crashing around them, she's on the verge of giving up. But then, something extraordinary happens. This is a story of survival, courage, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her pups. Before we dive into this heartwarming and emotional tale, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a thumbs up, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that inspires hope and compassion. Now, let's embark on a journey you won't forget. The sky stretched endlessly above, painted in shades of gray and blue as the ocean roared beneath. A rusted metal crate bobbed up and down on the frigid waters, its sides crusted with salt and seaweed. Inside, a trembling pit bull named Bella curled herself around her two tiny puppies. The waves splashed against the crate, each hit sending icy sprays into the air. Bella's body shivered, but she stayed close to her pups, her warmth, the only shield between them and the unforgiving cold. The puppies whimpered, their cries weak and filled with hunger. Bella licked them gently, her tongue brushing against their small, fragile bodies. She hadn't eaten in days, and her once muscular frame was now gaunt, her ribs visible beneath her thinning coat. The puppies' names were Max and Ruby, her pride and joy, her reason for enduring this nightmare. She nuzzled them softly, her heart breaking at their pitiful mews. Bella didn't know how long they had been out here. Days? A week? Time had blurred since the moment she was taken from the shelter. She remembered the smell of antiseptic and the distant sound of barking dogs. A man with rough hands had shoved her into this crate, her pups following soon after. Then came the deafening sound of the ocean as they were dumped into the abyss and left to fend for themselves. At first, Bella had barked frantically, her paws scraping against the metal sides of the crate. She called out for help, hoping someone, anyone, would hear her. But the vastness of the sea swallowed her cries, leaving only the sound of waves and the occasional screech of a distant gull. Eventually, her voice grew hoarse, and her strength faded. Now, she conserved what little energy she had for her babies. As the hours dragged on, the crate rocked back and forth with the waves. The puppies cried less, too exhausted and cold to make much noise. Bella closed her eyes, pressing her nose against them, her body shielding them as best as she could. She felt her resolve wavering. How long could she keep this up? The ocean seemed endless, and the faint hope of rescue felt like a cruel joke. Her eyelids grew heavy, and for a brief moment she considered giving in, letting the waves take her and her puppies into the deep. But then, a distant sound cut through the monotonous crash of the waves, a low hum, growing louder with each passing second. Bella's ears perked up, her body instantly alert. She lifted her head, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon. Was it real, or was she imagining things? The puppies stirred beneath her, sensing her sudden tension. In the distance, a small fishing boat emerged, its engine sputtering as it pushed through the waves. Bella's heart raced. It was her first glimmer of hope in what felt like an eternity. She rose shakily to her feet, careful not to jostle her puppies. Gathering every ounce of strength she had left, Bella let out a bark, a desperate, raspy sound that barely carried over the ocean. The boat continued on its path, seemingly unaware of the crate drifting in its vicinity. Bella barked again, louder this time, her voice breaking with the effort. She clawed at the edges of the crate, her nails scraping against the metal. The boat was getting closer, but it wasn't changing course. Panic surged through her as she realized this might be her only chance. If they didn't see her now, she and her puppies would be lost forever. Driven by sheer desperation, Bella did something she had never done before. She jumped up, throwing her body against the side of the crate, causing it to tip dangerously. The puppies squealed in fright, but Bella didn't stop. She barked again and again, each sound a plea for help. The crate rocked violently, and water began to slosh inside, soaking her paws. But finally, it worked. The boat shifted course. The engine's hum grew louder, and Bella saw a figure standing at the bow, pointing toward her. Relief washed over her as she slumped back down, her legs trembling. She looked down at her puppies, nudging them gently to reassure them. Help was coming. They were going to be okay. The boat pulled up alongside the crate, and two fishermen leaned over, their faces etched with shock and concern. One of them, a burly man with a thick beard, reached out a hand. "There's a dog in here, and puppies," he exclaimed, his voice filled with disbelief. The second man, younger and leaner, grabbed a net. "Hang on, girl. We've got you," he said softly, his tone soothing. Bella stared up at them, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. She wanted to trust them, but after everything she'd been through, it was hard to let her guard down. The older man leaned closer, speaking in a gentle voice. "It's okay, Mama. We're here to help." He reached down, his hand brushing against her fur. Bella flinched, but didn't pull away. She felt the strength in his grip as he carefully lifted her out of the crate, cradling her like she weighed nothing. The younger man followed, scooping up Max and Ruby, who whimpered but didn't resist. As the fishermen wrapped them in warm blankets, Bella let out a soft whine. For the first time in days, she felt the sting of tears. The ocean had tried to claim her and her babies, but fate had intervened. She didn't know where this journey would take them next, but for now, they were safe, and that was enough. Bella lay curled on a thick wool blanket, her body trembling as warmth returned to her exhausted muscles. The boat swayed gently beneath her, but compared to the chaos of the open sea, it felt like solid ground. Her two puppies, Max and Ruby, nestled close to her, their tiny bodies cocooned in small towels. For the first time in days, Bella didn't feel the icy wind cutting through her fur or the relentless slap of waves against her crate. Instead, she felt safety, though the fear of what came next still lingered. The two fishermen moved quickly around the small boat. The older man, named Joe, glanced over his shoulder as he guided the boat toward the shoreline. His brow furrowed, and his gruff exterior softened as he looked at Bella and her pups. "They've been through hell," he muttered to his younger companion, Pete. Pete nodded, crouching beside Bella with a bottle of water. He unscrewed the cap and poured some into a small dish. "Here, girl, you've got to be thirsty," he said gently, his voice calm and inviting. Bella's ears twitched at the sound, and she lifted her head slowly. Her eyes met Pete's, wary but searching for kindness. Pete slid the bowl closer, careful not to startle her. Bella hesitated, sniffing the air cautiously before leaning forward to lap at the water. The cool liquid soothed her dry throat, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a flicker of relief. Pete smiled, encouraged. "That's it. Good girl." Joe turned to Pete. "We need to get them to a vet as soon as we dock. Those pups look fragile, and she's skin and bones. No telling how long they were out there." Pete nodded in agreement, but frowned. "The nearest clinic's miles away, and they're barely holding on. What if they don't make it that far?" Joe gritted his teeth, his hands tightening on the wheel. "We'll make it," he said firmly, though the worry in his voice betrayed him. The coastline came into view, a small, rugged stretch of land dotted with fishing huts and a single dirt road leading to town. The boat slowed as it neared the dock, and Pete gently gathered Max and Ruby into his arms. The puppies stirred weakly, their tiny bodies so light they felt like feathers. Bella whined softly, her instinct to protect them kicking in, but she was too exhausted to move. "It's okay, Mama. I've got them," Pete reassured her. Joe stepped forward and scooped Bella into his arms, her frail body almost weightless. She didn't fight him. Something about the way his strong hands held her told her she could trust him, even if trust was a foreign concept to her. As they stepped onto the dock, The salty sea air gave way to the faint scent of earth and pine trees. Pete led the way, his pace quick but careful as he carried the puppies in their makeshift blankets. Bella's head rested against Joe's chest, her breathing shallow but steady. Every step toward land felt like a step away from the nightmare they had endured. The small fishing village was quiet, its residents busy with their own lives. A few people glanced their way, their eyes widening at the sight of the battered dog and her puppies. Whispers followed them, but Pete and Joe pressed on, focused on their mission. The vet clinic, a modest white building with a hand-painted sign that read Harper Veterinary Care, sat at the edge of town. Pete pushed the door open with his shoulder, the bell above it jingling loudly. A woman in her late 40s with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes looked up from the reception desk. Her name tag read, Dr. Harper. "Oh my, what happened?" Dr. Harper asked, rising from her chair. Her gaze shifted to Bella and the puppies, her professional composure barely masking her concern. "They were floating out at sea," Joe explained, his voice steady but grim. "No idea how long they've been out there. They're cold, starving, and weak." Dr. Harper nodded briskly, motioning them toward an exam room. "Bring them in quickly. Let's get them checked out." The room smelled faintly of antiseptic, and Bella tensed as Joe laid her down on the exam table. Her mind flashed back to the shelter where she'd first been separated from the world she knew. Her body stiffened, but a soft hand on her head brought her back. Dr. Harper crouched beside her, speaking in soothing tones. "You're safe now, Mama. I promise," she said. Bella's eyes softened, and she let out a small whimper, as if she understood. Dr. Harper began her examination, checking Bella's heartbeat and gently feeling her ribs. "She's severely malnourished and dehydrated," she said, her tone serious but not hopeless. She moved on to Max and Ruby, her face softening as she inspected the tiny pups. "They're weak, but they have a chance. We'll need to act fast." Pete stepped forward. "What do they need? Whatever it is, just tell us." Dr. Harper looked up, her expression a mixture of determination and caution. "They need fluids, warmth, and food. The puppies are going to require round-the-clock care. It won't be easy, but it's possible." Joe and Pete exchanged a glance, unspoken agreement passing between them. Joe nodded. "We'll do whatever it takes." Dr. Harper smiled faintly. "Then let's get to work." As the team sprang into action, Bella watched them with tired but hopeful eyes. She didn't understand their words, but she could feel the shift in the air, the promise of safety and care. For the first time, the weight on her chest felt just a little lighter. Max and Ruby snuggled closer to her, their tiny breaths a reminder of why she couldn't give up. As the clinic's door closed behind them, the stormy sea and the rusted crate felt like a distant memory. Bella didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing. They had a chance now, and that was everything. The sterile brightness of the clinic contrasted sharply with the dark, endless ocean Bella had endured. Lying on a padded blanket in the exam room, she watched with tired eyes as the humans moved around her. She could sense their urgency, their voices calm but firm as they worked to save her family. Max and Ruby rested nearby, each wrapped in tiny heating pads. Their frail bodies barely stirred, but their soft breaths gave Bella the strength to hold on. Dr. Harper leaned over the puppies, attaching small tubes to deliver much-needed fluids. She glanced at Bella, her brow furrowed in concentration. "She's a fighter, but these pups are in critical condition. If they make it through the night, they'll have a real shot." Pete stood at Bella's side, gently stroking her head. "They'll make it," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "They have to." Joe, leaning against the counter with arms crossed, sighed heavily. "You know we can't leave them here, right? They'll need more care than the clinic can provide. Someone has to take them home." Pete looked up sharply. "And who's going to do that? You?" "Because I already know the answer." His tone was playful, but there was a seriousness behind his words. Joe grumbled but didn't argue. Fine. I'll set up a space in the garage, but you're taking the night shifts. Pete smirked. Deal. Dr. Harper interrupted, her tone firm. Before you make promises, understand this isn't just feeding and walking. These dogs are in a delicate state. They'll need constant attention, proper nutrition, and a lot of patience. Her gaze softened as she looked at Bella. But if anyone deserves that chance, it's her. The words hung in the air as Bella lifted her head weakly, her eyes locking with Dr. Harper's. It was as if she understood. Her survival and that of her pups rested entirely on the humans around her. She let out a soft whine, her tail giving a faint wag. It wasn't much, but it was enough to spark hope. Later that evening, Bella and her puppies were carefully loaded into Pete's truck. The fisherman had followed Dr. Harper's instructions to the letter, setting up a makeshift recovery area in Joe's garage. Blankets were layered thickly on the floor, a space heater hummed in the corner, and bowls of fresh water and soft food sat nearby. Bella settled in cautiously, her body still weak, but her protective instincts fully engaged. Pete placed Max and Ruby beside her, their tiny forms barely moving. He sat cross-legged on the floor, watching them intently. "You've got some fighters, Bella," Pete murmured, reaching out to scratch behind her ear. "But you're the real hero, aren't you? You kept them alive when no one else could." Joe appeared in the doorway, a steaming mug in hand. "You talking to the dog again?" he teased, though his tone lacked bite. He set the mug down and knelt beside Pete, his expression softening as he looked at Bella. "She deserves it." Bella let out a low sigh, her body relaxing slightly for the first time. For now, they were warm, fed, and safe. But the journey was far from over. The quiet of the night was broken by a sharp cry. Pete jolted awake from where he'd been dozing in a chair. Bella was standing now, her body tense, her eyes fixed on Ruby. The tiny puppy was twitching, her breath shallow and rapid. "Joe!" Pete shouted, scrambling to his feet. Joe rushed in, his face pale. "What's happening?" "It's Ruby. She's not breathing right." Pete gently lifted the pup, cradling her as Bella whined frantically. Her wide, desperate eyes pleaded with him to do something. Joe grabbed his keys. "We're not waiting. Get her in the truck. Now." Pete nodded, rushing outside with Ruby in his arms. Bella tried to follow, but her weak legs gave out beneath her. Joe crouched beside her, his voice steady but kind. "You stay here with Max. We'll bring Ruby back. I promise." Bella barked once, a sound filled with anguish, as the truck roared to life and sped away into the night. Alone with Max, she licked the remaining puppy, her heart pounding. She didn't understand where they were going, but she knew one thing: she couldn't lose Ruby. The vet clinic was empty when Pete and Joe arrived, but Dr. Harper had given them an emergency number. Within minutes, she was there, pulling Ruby into the exam room. Pete paced outside, his hands running through his hair. "She has to make it," he muttered, his voice cracking. "She's just a baby." Joe placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm. "Harper knows what she's doing. We've done all we can." Inside, Dr. Harper worked quickly, administering oxygen and monitoring Ruby's tiny heart. The puppy's chest rose and fell unevenly, each breath a battle. But slowly, the rhythm steadied. Her breathing became less labored, her body relaxing under the vet's care. Dr. Harper emerged after what felt like hours, her expression tired but hopeful. "She's stable," she said, and Pete nearly collapsed with relief. "But she's not out of the woods yet. She needs constant monitoring." Pete nodded, his resolve solidifying, whatever it takes. When Ruby was finally brought back home, Bella's relief was palpable. She sniffed her pup frantically, licking her face and pulling her close. Max wiggled beside them, his small tail wagging weakly as he nuzzled his sister. Bella's heart swelled, for now her family was together. Pete sat down beside them, stroking Bella's head. "You're incredible. You know that?" he whispered. "No matter what." We're going to get through this. Together. Bella looked up at him, her tired eyes filled with gratitude. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, it didn't feel impossible. The early morning light filtered through the garage's windows, painting soft, golden streaks across the makeshift recovery area. Bella lay protectively around her 2 puppies, her body still weak, but her resolve unshaken. Ruby, now stable but fragile, snuggled close to her brother Max, their tiny breaths synchronized in the stillness. Bella let out a quiet sigh, a mix of exhaustion and relief. They had survived another night. Pete entered the garage quietly, carrying a tray with fresh water, warm broth, and a small bowl of soft food. He knelt beside Bella, careful not to startle her. "Good morning, Mama," he said softly, his voice filled with warmth. "How are the little ones?" Bella's ears perked up at his tone, and she looked at him with cautious eyes. Over the past few days, Pete had been her constant presence, ensuring she and her pups were cared for. Though she had started to trust him, remnants of her past still made her wary. She watched as he gently set the bowls down, his movements slow and deliberate. "Look," Pete said, pointing to the food. "I brought you something special. You've got to eat, girl. Those pups need you strong." Bella sniffed the air, the savory scent of broth tempting her. Hunger gnawed at her belly, but her protective instincts kept her attention on the puppies. Pete waited patiently, giving her space. Finally, she leaned forward, cautiously lapping at the broth. The warmth spread through her, reviving her body one sip at a time. "You're amazing. You know that?" Pete said, his hand resting on the floor near her. "Everything you've been through, and you're still fighting for them." Bella paused, her gaze locking with his. For the first time, she nudged his hand with her nose. A small gesture, but one filled with meaning. Pete's heart swelled as he gently scratched behind her ears. "That's it, girl. We're in this together." Over the next few days, Bella began to settle into her new reality. Max and Ruby grew stronger, their tiny tails wagging whenever Pete or Joe approached. Bella herself started to regain weight, her coat slowly losing its dullness as her body healed. She still carried the weight of her ordeal, but the consistent care and kindness from Pete and Joe began to chip away at her fear. Pete had taken to spending hours with them, often sleeping on a cot in the garage to keep an eye on the pups. He would talk to Bella as if she were an old friend, sharing stories about his childhood, his dreams, and his love for dogs. Bella listened, her eyes following him as if she understood every word. Joe, though gruff and less talkative, played his part too. He brought supplies, researched the best ways to care for abandoned puppies, and even built a small pen for the pups to explore as they grew stronger. Bella began to trust him as well, though her bond with Pete was undeniable. One afternoon, as Pete was cleaning out the garage, a knock came at the front door. Joe answered it, his expression hardening when he saw the man standing on the porch. The stranger was tall, with a worn baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. His voice was rough as he said, "I'm looking for a dog." Joe's shoulders stiffened. "What dog?" The man's lips curled into a smirk. "A pitbull. Female. Should have been in a crate with some puppies. Heard she might have washed up around here." Pete appeared behind Joe, his face darkening as he recognized the implication. "What do you want with her?" Pete asked sharply. The man shrugged, his tone dismissive. "She's mine. Lost her out at sea. Just came to get her back." Joe's hands balled into fists. "You abandoned her, didn't you? Left her to die out there with her pups." The man's smirk faltered. "It's none of your business. Now, where is she?" Pete stepped forward, his voice cold. "You're not getting anywhere near her. You've done enough damage." The man's eyes narrowed. "You don't want trouble." Joe crossed his arms, his stance solid. "Leave, now, or you'll find out exactly what kind of trouble you're looking for." The tension hung thick in the air, but the man finally spat on the ground and turned away. "This ain't over," he muttered, before walking back to his truck and driving off. Pete and Joe exchanged a look, their concern evident. "You think he'll come back?" Pete asked, his voice low. Joe sighed. "Probably, but we'll be ready." Pete returned to the garage, his heart heavy. Bella looked up at him, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. She seemed to sense the unease in the air, her body tensing as she glanced toward the door. Pete knelt beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her head. "Don't worry, girl. No one's taking you or your babies. Not while we're here." Bella leaned into his touch, her trust in him growing deeper. For the first time she felt something she hadn't known in a long time. Safety. That night, Pete stayed awake, sitting beside Bella and the pups. The garage was quiet, save for the soft hum of the heater and the rhythmic breathing of the dogs. He couldn't shake the image of the man at the door or the anger in his voice. Looking at Bella, he made a silent vow. Whatever it took, he would protect her and her family. They had come too far, endured too much, to let anyone tear them apart now. As Bella rested her head on her paws, her body relaxed in a way Pete hadn't seen before. Despite the shadows of her past, she had found something worth holding on to, a glimmer of hope. The following days passed quietly, but an undercurrent of tension lingered. Pete and Joe worked hard to create a secure environment for Bella and her puppies, adding locks to the garage door and installing a motion sensor light outside. Bella seemed to sense their concern. Though she'd grown more relaxed with her new caregivers, she remained alert, her ears twitching at the slightest sound. Max and Ruby, oblivious to the unease, were thriving. They'd started exploring their small pen, stumbling over one another in playful clumsiness. Their growing strength was a source of joy for Pete, who spent hours on the floor with them, encouraging their curiosity. Bella watched him closely, her trust in him deepening with every gentle touch and kind word. But even as the puppies grew stronger, the memory of the stranger's visit haunted Pete. He couldn't shake the image of the man's smirk or the venom in his words. The question loomed over him. How far would someone like that go? Late one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a deep indigo, Pete sat in the garage, tinkering with an old radio. Bella lay nearby, her head resting on her paws as she watched him. Max and Ruby were asleep, their tiny bodies curled together in a patch of warmth. "You've come a long way, girl," Pete said, glancing at Bella. "I don't know what your life was like before, but you're safe now. I promise." Bella's ears twitched, and she let out a soft huff, as if acknowledging his words. Pete smiled and leaned back against the wall. "I've got big plans for you and your pups. Just wait. A better life is coming." As if on cue, the radio crackled to life, filling the garage with faint music. Pete chuckled. "Guess I've still got it," he said, adjusting the dial. Bella's tail thumped softly against the blanket, the sound momentarily lightening the heavy atmosphere. But as the evening stretched on, the wind outside began to pick up. Pete stood and peeked out the small window, noticing the trees swaying in the growing gusts. Storm clouds loomed in the distance, their dark edges illuminated by occasional flashes of lightning. Joe's voice came from the doorway. "Looks like a storm's rolling in. You'd better hunker down out here." Pete nodded. "I'll stay with them tonight, just in case." Joe hesitated, his face grim. "You think he might come back?" Pete didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at Bella, who was now sitting up, her ears perked and her body tense. "If he does, he'll regret it," Pete said finally, his voice low and resolute. The storm hit hard just after midnight. Rain pounded against the garage roof, and the wind howled like a living thing. Pete sat on the floor beside Bella, his hand resting on her back as they listened to the storm together. Max and Ruby whimpered in their sleep, but Bella's presence kept them calm. Then, amidst the chaos of the storm, a sound cut through, a metallic scrape at the garage door. Bella shot to her feet, a low growl rumbling in her throat. Pete froze, his heart pounding. The sound came again, followed by the faint crunch of footsteps on gravel. Pete reached for the flashlight he kept nearby, flicking it on. He crept toward the door, motioning for Bella to stay back. But Bella wouldn't budge. She stood beside him, her body rigid and ready, her protective instincts taking over. "Who's there?" Pete called out, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. Silence. Then a voice came from the other side. "Just me. Figured I'd stop by for what's mine." Pete's jaw tightened. It was the man from before. "You're trespassing. Leave now, or I'll call the police." The man laughed, a cruel, hollow sound. "Go ahead. But by the time they get here, it'll be too late." Pete's grip on the flashlight tightened, and he glanced down at Bella. Her growl had deepened, her sharp eyes locked on the door. The man's voice grew louder. "You think you can keep her? She's just a dog. Nothing special." "She's family," Pete shot back. "And you're not getting near her or her pups." The man didn't respond, but Pete heard the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged against the door. He stepped back, his mind racing. The garage wasn't just a shelter. It was a battleground now. As the tension reached its peak, the sound of sirens broke through the storm. Pete felt a surge of relief. Joe had been keeping watch from the house and must have called for help. The man cursed loudly, his footsteps retreating as the sirens grew closer. Pete opened the garage door just enough to see the man sprinting toward a battered pickup truck parked down the road. The flashing lights of a patrol car illuminated him as he sped away into the night. The officer stepped out of the car, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. "Everything okay here?" he asked. Pete nodded, his breath finally steadying. "He's gone. For now." The officer frowned. "We'll keep an eye out. Let us know if he comes back." As the patrol car drove off, Pete closed the garage door and turned back to Bella. She was sitting in front of the pups, her body a shield between them and the world. Pete knelt beside her, resting his forehead against hers. "You're safe, girl. We're all safe." Bella let out a soft whine, her tail wagging faintly. For the first time, Pete allowed himself to believe it. Together, they had faced the storm and won. The storm had passed, leaving behind a quiet, cool morning. The garage was bathed in soft sunlight that streamed through the windows, casting warm patches of light on the floor. Bella stretched cautiously, her muscles still sore from days of stress and survival. Nearby, Max and Ruby tumbled over each other in playful clumsiness, their energy a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous night. Pete sat cross-legged on the floor, his eyes fixed on the puppies as they explored their pen. He smiled, the weight of recent events easing with every squeak and wag of their tiny tails. Bella approached him, nudging his hand with her nose. He looked at her and chuckled softly, scratching behind her ears. "You're something else. You know that," he murmured. Joe stepped into the garage, a fresh cup of coffee in hand. His gruff demeanor softened as he watched the scene before him. "They look good this morning," he said, nodding toward the puppies. "They're getting stronger," Pete replied. "But Bella, she's the real hero. She's been through so much and still hasn't given up." Joe crouched beside Bella, giving her a gentle pat. "Well, she's not fighting alone anymore." The near confrontation with the man who had abandoned Bella haunted both Pete and Joe, but they were determined to protect her and her pups. They filed a report with the local authorities, ensuring that any further attempts to harm or reclaim the dogs would be met with swift legal action. Pete also began networking with local animal organizations, sharing Bella's story to raise awareness about her plight. Dr. Harper visited regularly to check on Bella, Max, and Ruby. The pups grew stronger with each passing day, their playful energy filling the garage with life. Bella, too, began to thrive. Her coat regained its sheen, and her eyes sparkled with a newfound confidence. She no longer flinched at every sound or movement. Instead, she greeted Pete and Joe with a wagging tail and a gentle nudge, her gratitude evident in every gesture. One afternoon, as Pete watched the puppies wrestle over a small chew toy, he turned to Joe. "You know, they deserve more than this garage." Joe raised an eyebrow. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking they need a real home, a backyard to run in, a couch to nap on. They've been through enough. It's time they had the life they deserve." Joe sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "And you think you're the guy for the job?" Pete smiled, scratching the back of his neck. "I don't just think, I know." The decision was made. Over the next few weeks, Pete worked tirelessly to prepare his small house for its new residents. He built a fenced-in yard, complete with a shaded area for Bella and plenty of space for the pups to play. He bought toys, bedding, and more food than he thought 3 dogs could possibly eat. With every nail he hammered and every purchase he made, his excitement grew. When the day finally came to bring them home, Bella seemed to sense the significance of the moment. She climbed into Pete's truck with Max and Ruby, her tail wagging steadily. Pete looked at her in the rearview mirror and smiled. "You ready, Mama? This is it, the start of something new." As they pulled into Pete's driveway, Bella's ears perked up. The puppies scrambled to peek out the window, their small paws pressing against the glass. Pete opened the door, and Bella jumped out, sniffing the air. She took a cautious step forward, her eyes scanning the yard. Pete knelt beside her, his voice soft. "Go on, girl. This is yours now." Bella looked at him, then at the yard, before bounding forward. Max and Ruby tumbled out after her, their tiny legs carrying them in clumsy zigzags as they explored their new home. Pete watched, his chest swelling with pride and joy. As the sun set on their first evening at the house, Pete was startled by a knock at the door. He opened it to find Dr. Harper standing there, a small package in her hands. "Thought I'd drop this off," she said, smiling. Pete invited her in, and she handed him the package. Inside was a leather collar for Bella, engraved with her name and a message. "Forever loved." Pete's throat tightened as he read the words. He looked at Dr. Harper, his gratitude evident. "This is perfect. Thank you." Dr. Harper glanced at Bella, who was lying on the couch with Max and Ruby sprawled across her. "You've given them a second chance," she said. "And I think they've given you one too." Pete nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "They've changed everything." That night, Pete sat on the porch, Bella resting at his feet while the puppies dozed inside. The stars were bright, and the air was cool, carrying with it a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He reached down, scratching Bella behind her ears. "We made it, girl. You and me." Bella looked up at him, her eyes shining with trust and affection. Her tail thumped softly against the wooden porch, a quiet but powerful affirmation. Together, they had survived the storm. Together, they had found a new beginning. And together they would face whatever the future held. The morning sun poured over the yard, painting the grass in hues of gold and green. Max and Ruby chased each other around a small patch of wildflowers, their tiny barks filling the air with joy. Bella lay in the shade of a tree, her watchful eyes following their every move. Pete sat nearby on the porch steps, sipping coffee and soaking in the tranquility. For the first time in what felt like forever, everything felt right. Pete had spent weeks transforming his modest home into a sanctuary for Bella and her pups. The once empty yard was now brimming with life, a space filled with toys, beds, and a sturdy doghouse, though Bella and the pups much preferred the comfort of Pete's couch. It wasn't just a home for them. It had become a home for Pete as well, filling a void he hadn't realized was so deep. That afternoon, Pete decided to commemorate their journey. He called Dr. Harper and Joe over, surprising them with a small celebration. A simple banner that read "Welcome Home" hung above the porch, and a few balloons bobbed in the gentle breeze. Pete had even baked a dog-friendly cake for Bella, Max, and Ruby, a mix of peanut butter, oats, and love. When Dr. Harper arrived, she smiled at the sight of Bella lounging comfortably in the yard. "She looks like a completely different dog," she said, walking up to Pete. "She's finally where she belongs," Pete replied, his voice soft. "They all are." Joe appeared with a camera slung around his neck. "All right, let's get some pictures of the family," he said, gesturing for Pete to gather the dogs. Pete laughed and called Bella over. She came immediately, her tail wagging as she nudged against his leg. Max and Ruby followed, tumbling over one another in their excitement. The four of them sat together on the porch steps, Pete's arms around Bella, while the pups wriggled between them. Joe snapped the photo, grinning. "That's a keeper." As the day wound down, Pete found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. He thought of the crate bobbing in the icy ocean, Bella's exhausted body shielding her pups, and the desperate bark that had saved them all. He thought of the man who had abandoned them and the storm they had endured. But most of all, he thought of Bella's unwavering spirit, the determination in her eyes, the strength in her heart, and the love she had for her puppies. Despite everything she'd faced, she had fought to survive. And now, she had a family who would never let her go. That night, as Pete sat on the couch with Bella curled beside him, he gently clipped the leather collar around her neck. The engraved words, "Forever loved," caught the light, a reminder of everything she had overcome. "You're not just a dog, Bella," Pete whispered, resting his hand on her head. "You're family." Bella pressed her nose against his hand, her eyes soft with trust. In that moment, Pete realized that she had given him just as much as he had given her. She had taught him about resilience, love, and the power of second chances. The next morning, Pete woke to the sound of Max and Ruby scrambling across the floor, their playful barks echoing through the house. He found Bella already up, standing by the door with her tail wagging. She was ready to start the day, her energy renewed, and her spirit unbroken. As Pete opened the door, the three dogs bounded outside, racing toward the yard. Bella led the way, her confidence evident in every stride. Watching her, Pete felt a swell of pride. She had come so far, and there was no doubt in his mind that she would continue to thrive. As the sun rose higher, Pete grabbed a ball and joined them in the yard. Laughter, barks, and the sound of paws on grass filled the air, a symphony of joy that marked the beginning of a brighter future. Bella, Max, and Ruby had found their forever home, and in doing so, they had given Pete a purpose he hadn't known he needed. Together, they were a family, a testament to the resilience of the heart and the healing power of love. If this story touched your heart, remember that every animal deserves a chance at love and safety. Consider adopting, supporting your local shelters, or spreading awareness about the resilience and beauty of animals like Bella. Subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this story with someone who loves inspiring tales of courage and hope. Together, we can make a difference.